Hello and welcome. This compilation looks at Steve Ditko's time on Spider-Man. For just over 3 years, Ditko and Stan Lee produced a character that has endured for decades. The appeal of the character was established during those early, formative years, creating a legacy that others would build upon. Yet at the height of the character's popularity, and arguably at the point he had the most control, Ditko stepped away from Spider-Man. This has led to a lot of speculation about his reasons for leaving and what exactly happened between himself and Stan Lee. Being a private person, and, in many ways, quietly hostile towards the media, Ditko said very little about his time at Marvel. He would break that silence in the early 2000s in a series of essays that outlined his experience. Somewhat. He would sometimes be direct, and sometimes he'd be vague. He would be very thorough, taking time to establish the criteria for his opinions and the evidence to support it. But then he only addressed points that he thought were relevant. He didn't always provide the specific information fans were curious about. So there's some mystery and debate that persists concerning Ditko's involvement with Spider-Man. This compilation looks at some of the more popular topics concerning that period. The best place to begin is the creation of Spider-Man. The creation of Spider-Man involves 3 legendary creators: Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, and Steve Ditko. While it's generally acknowledged that Spider-Man is a co-creation of Lee and Ditko, Kirby was involved at an early stage. And in some interviews, Kirby has claimed the character was solely created by himself. So despite appearances, the creation of the world-famous Spider-Man is a bit more convoluted than one might expect. All 3 creators have their own versions concerning the evolution of the character and who created what. And, like with all eternal debates, there is little tangible evidence to fully support one side or another. It should be mentioned, the scope of this video is limited to Spider-Man's first appearance in Amazing Fantasy number 15. Any developments in the regular series are a topic for another day. Let's examine these claims and see what we can see. Jack Kirby's version of events needs a little context. For the majority of the 1960s, Kirby was instrumental in creating or co-creating the most well-known characters in the Marvel Universe. The complete list of characters and stories done by Kirby is impressive and immense. For at least the first 3 or 4 years of Marvel's existence, Kirby's fingerprints are practically on every character or series they published. It's reasonably safe to say, without Kirby's dedication and input, Stan Lee's effort to transform Marvel into a hip, viable publishing company might not have succeeded. At the same time, Kirby's efforts were not fairly rewarded. That is, he received credit for being an artist, and minimal, sometimes vague credit for plotting. The majority of the credit for all the characters that were created and the stories that were written went to Stan Lee. Because, as Kirby said, quote, "Well, I never wrote the credits." Unquote. So given the fact that Kirby was very active in establishing early Marvel, his claims that he created Spider-Man cannot be immediately dismissed. The earliest instance I could find of Jack Kirby claiming he created Spider-Man was a 1982 interview with Will Eisner. This interview, published in The Spirit magazine, Kirby briefly states, quote, "Joe Simon and I had a strip, or a script called The Silver Spider. The Silver Spider was going into a magazine called Black Magic. Black Magic folded with the publisher Crestwood, and we were left with the script. I believe I said this could become a thing called Spider-Man, so the idea was already there when I talked to Stan." Unquote. That same year, Kirby stated something similar in Comic Scene. Quote, "I did a mess of things. The only book I didn't work on was Spider-Man, which Steve Ditko did, but Spider-Man was my creation." Unquote. Infamously, in a 1990 interview with the Comics Journal, Kirby once again stated, quote, "I created Spider-Man. We decided to give it to Steve Ditko. I drew the first Spider-Man cover. I created the character. I created the costume." Unquote. Now, in the course of doing research, I ran across a piece concerning this claim written by Tom Brevoort. It is an excellent summary that aligns with everything I had previously read. For a further, more detailed account, I highly recommend reading it. The bullet points are: Kirby's publishing partner, Joe Simon, created an unused character called the Silver Spider in the late 1950s. For the record, it was developed by Joe Simon, C.C. Beck, and Jack Oleck. A few pages and a script are available online. Kirby's involvement with Silver Spider, if he had any, was indirect or minimal. Regardless, the story was never published. The unpublished Silver Spider story was then transformed into a Spider-Man concept by Kirby and Simon, with Simon creating a logo. This Spider-Man, like the Silver Spider, also went unused. A few years later, Kirby and Simon created The Fly for Archie Comics. The Fly utilized the Silver Spider's origin and a few elements they intended for the Spider-Man concept. Notably, he was an orphan that comes into possession of a magic ring that transforms him into an adult superhero called The Fly. Again, we move forward a few years. In Kirby's version of events, during the early days of Marvel, he was the person pushing to add more superhero concepts. One such concept was Spider-Man, which he suggested to Lee. Lee then proposed the idea to the publisher, Martin Goodman, and it was approved. Kirby drew 5 pages of material, which Lee gave to Steve Ditko to be inked. Anecdotally, those pages contained one splash page of Kirby's Spider-Man design, and the rest were the origin of the character. In that Kirby version, Peter Parker was an orphan being raised by his aunt and uncle. One day, he comes into possession of a magic ring that transforms him into an adult superhero, Spider-Man. These pages, if they do exist, have never been discovered. It's possible they were either thrown away or otherwise destroyed, or they were taken by an unknown person and currently reside in someone's private collection. However, by all accounts, Kirby was the first to make an attempt at Spider-Man. This is not in dispute. What is in dispute is the level of contribution Kirby brought to Spider-Man. As a brief side note, as previously mentioned, the original Kirby Spider-Man pages have never been located. However, one image has appeared online that some suggest is one of these original drawings. It's not, it's a fake. In a post by Daniel Best, he debunks the image, stating it's a repurposed image of Giant Man from Tales to Astonish number 51. And, well, let's just say the evidence is compelling. When it comes to Stan Lee, his default approach when speaking, writing, or being interviewed was one of hyperbole, self-effacing charm, and showmanship for the sake of telling an engaging story. With all sincerity, he was a charming and intelligent man who revived a failing company, infused a dying genre with excitement, and who, seemingly, had nothing but fun creating 4-color fantasies for the world to enjoy. His enthusiasm and manner were infectious. To greatly paraphrase something Steve Ditko once wrote, if you remove Lee from the equation that made Marvel successful, the odds of having the same success with another individual in Lee's place are functionally non-existent. Lee's sensibilities helped shape Marvel Comics in its formative years. Lee's accomplishments are indisputable, and he deserves credit for what he achieved. That being said, he repeatedly assumed credit for work he was not solely responsible for creating. And more often than not, he diminished the involvement of others while elevating his own. This, along with his showmanship style, is one of the major reasons why Lee's version of events is difficult to accept at face value. Which isn't to suggest it's entirely false, but it might not be as accurate as one might originally presume. Lee was more concerned with telling an engaging story that had dramatic embellishments, which was an approach that undermined any factual accuracy. According to Lee, the idea for Spider-Man was entirely his own, partially inspired by seeing a fly crawl up the wall while he was typing. Lee was also inspired by the Spider, a pulp and radio action hero who fought underworld crime. What he originally had in mind was a teenage superhero one the audience could identify with. He would be an unglamorous orphan nerd that lived with his aunt and uncle. And despite having superpowers, such as super strength and the ability to cling to walls, he'd deal with everyday relatable problems, like being unlucky with the ladies and having no money for basic needs. Unfortunately, the publisher, Martin Goodman, hated the idea of a teen superhero, and he disliked the Spider origin for the character even more. At the time Lee made this proposal, the comic, Amazing Adult Fantasy, which was primarily done by Lee and Steve Ditko, was being cancelled. Due to this, Lee got Goodman's approval to print the Spider-Man idea in the last issue, because if it failed to connect with an audience, it wouldn't matter, the title was already being cancelled. Lee then assigned Jack Kirby the task of creating the story and character design, and then assigning Steve Ditko the inking chores. Kirby then produced 5 pages of material. However, Lee thought Kirby's design didn't fit with his vision of a less muscular, spider-like nerd. Kirby was also busy doing everything else for Marvel, so Lee assigned Ditko the task of taking his vision for Spider-Man and making it real. Naturally, Ditko didn't disappoint, and the results were printed in the final issue of Amazing Fantasy, the cover to which was penciled by Jack Kirby and inked by Steve Ditko. Like the two prior creators, Steve Ditko was a massive talent. Unlike the two prior creators, Ditko avoided interviews or bringing any attention to his accomplishments. It wasn't modesty or humility that made him silent, it was his evolving adherence to objectivism. To be brief, due to his philosophical point of view, Ditko believed the quality of his work should speak for itself. It was unnecessary for him to elaborate concerning its merits or its meaning. This position seemed to extend to discussing anything publicly, especially interviews. Yet, Ditko did discuss some aspects of the industry in various essays, the majority of which are exceptionally difficult to locate. So his point of view concerning topics, such as the creation of Spider-Man, are reasonably obscure and not well represented, but they do exist. According to Ditko, his involvement with Spider-Man began when he was given 5 pages of Kirby artwork to ink. In my research, I could not determine why Ditko was chosen as the inker rather than one of Marvel's usual inkers, or someone more familiar with Kirby's style. I would speculate the most probable reason Lee chose Ditko was due to him being the regular penciler for Amazing Adult Fantasy. With Kirby drawing the Spider-Man story, this would be lost income for Ditko. So to compensate, Lee gave the inking job to Ditko. Perhaps a minor point to some, but it's a detail that stood out to me. Regarding these 5 pages, Ditko wrote in 2002, quote, "The splash page was the only one with a drawing of Spider-Man, a typical Kirby hero/action shot. The other 4 pages showed a teenager living with his aunt and uncle. The aunt was a kindly old woman, and the uncle was a retired police captain, hard, gruff, and he was down on the teenager. Next door, or somewhere in the neighborhood, there was a whiskered scientist type involved in some kind of experiment or project. The end of the 5 pages depicted the kid going towards the scientist's darkened house." Unquote. Ditko even supplied a drawing of what he recalled the Spider-Man looked like, as drawn by Kirby. After seeing these pages, Ditko remarked to Lee that Spider-Man was very similar to the Archie Comics character, The Fly. At some later point, Lee asked Ditko to do the Spider-Man story. Ditko was never informed why the change was being made, and he never speculated why Kirby's pages were not being used, although the implication is obvious. Ditko was given a synopsis by Lee to work from. From there, he designed all the characters. He created the costume design and expanded the story into 11 pages. For the record, Ditko also created the web shooters to replace the webgun and holster. Again, Ditko deferred speculation concerning whether the synopsis he was given was entirely written by Lee or whether it contained plot beats from Kirby. Regardless, Ditko took what he was given, broke it down, and brought it to life. Ditko also drew a cover for that issue. However, Lee rejected it and had Kirby draw a similar version from a different, more dynamic perspective. Ditko inked this cover. With that, the final published version of Spider-Man's origin was complete. Determining who created what, especially without any concrete proof, such as Kirby's original pages, Lee's original synopsis, and Ditko's script notes, is a difficult process. Everything is circumstantial. That being said, it would be hard to argue that Kirby created Spider-Man, at least not the version that was published in 1962. He may have created a version of Spider-Man with Joe Simon and another with Stan Lee, but neither version resembled the Spider-Man that saw print. It is possible that one element, an orphan living with his aunt and uncle, did originate with Kirby, and that may be the totality of his contribution. Although, one could argue, the web shooters were inspired by the webgun from Kirby's design. Another possible Kirby element is the ability to cling to walls. Whether that addition originated with Kirby or Lee is hard to discern. Regardless, even if all 3 elements could be attributed to Kirby, the end result was still quite different from what he envisioned. Continuing with Kirby's claim, the costume design was certainly Steve Ditko's. Not only does Ditko emphatically state this, but Lee doesn't mention Ditko using Kirby's design as a foundation for a new design. Stylistically, it could be argued it's in line with other Ditko designs from that era. So Kirby's statements that he created Spider-Man and he designed the costume are not well supported. As a side note, some may point out that Ditko's costume design bears a striking resemblance to a 1954 Halloween costume. Like many others, I would suggest this is a coincidence. Thematically, it only makes sense that a spider-based character would have a web design on their costume. As far as I can tell, Ditko never addressed this connection. And, considering Ditko's character, it's hard to believe he would intentionally steal a design or not acknowledge it as an influence. End of side note. As for who created what in the published version, it has to be noted that Ditko has never stated that he believes Spider-Man to be his sole creation. He has said that it is a co-creation between himself and Stan Lee. Ditko acknowledges that Lee had the idea, but he had to take that abstract spider concept and give it shape. Furthermore, Ditko took a 1 or 2 page synopsis and transformed it into 11 pages of story, adding what was necessary to hit all the dramatic beats. So, his involvement wasn't passive. What Ditko takes exception to, and where he and Lee disagree, is Lee undermining or downplaying Ditko's involvement. In 1986, Lee had this to say about crediting artists. Quote, "I think I've been very generous, because as I say, anywhere except the comic book business, the artist would not be considered a co-creator. The guy who says the idea, he's the creator. The guy who drew it is just drawing it after the creator told him to draw it." Unquote. It has to be noted, Lee was very generous with praise for the artists. That's well documented. But actual credit for co-creation? Not so much. It would be another decade before Stan Lee revised that opinion. Even then, he was non-specific and made declarations that were open to interpretation. In my opinion, Lee genuinely thought he was the sole creator. But after public pressure and criticism, he conceded the point, using language that protected Marvel from litigation. After all, considering an artist as a co-creator is not the same as blatantly stating the artist is a co-creator. There are other quotes from Lee, before and since, that underscore this point. However, to avoid being pedantic or coming off as a Stan Lee hater, I'm going to restrict it to one. The point has been made. Lee was not very good at acknowledging the collaborative nature of the medium, and he was consistent in that opinion through the years. Separately, both Kirby and Ditko objected to this position, and rightfully, they took offense that their contributions were diminished. In the end, who created Spider-Man and his iconic look? Kirby took a shot at it, but it was not to Lee's expectations, and it allegedly closely resembled a pre-existing character. Ditko took a shot with Lee's direction, and that resulted in the known character. So after weighing all the various arguments, the circumstantial evidence, and the potential influences, an accurate credit would be a co-creation between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. Nowadays, this topic is not in dispute. It's commonly accepted that Kirby's involvement was limited to the cover, and the actual creation of Spider-Man was done by both Lee and Ditko. But I recall a time when there was a fair amount of debate. For that reason, I thought it was a topic worth visiting and compiling all the evidence in one complete package. The only notable piece of information that was not included was a bit about the logo. Originally, the logo didn't have a hyphen, but then it was added. There's a debate whether the hyphen was added to distance itself from the logo created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, or whether it was to avoid comparison to the Superman logo, which seems to be the most likely case. After all, DC could get litigious, considering their most popular property. Ultimately, I thought this was a very trivial deviation, and there was far more compelling evidence to examine. Now let's look at the inspiration for Gwen Stacy. Hello and welcome. While researching a prior video about Steve Ditko, I ran across this piece of information on Wikipedia. Quote, "Created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, Gwen Stacy first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man number 31. Stan Lee claimed that his wife, Joan, was the inspiration for Gwen." Unquote. Those two sentences led me down an accidental rabbit hole when I tried to confirm the validity of either sentence. I know, it's a silly piece of trivia to, well, probably everyone but me. I get that. But if Gwen Stacy was actually inspired by Joan Lee, that changed a certain portion of the Ditko video I was researching. Let me get specific. Some speculate that the lead character in the adult comic, Sweeter Gwen, was based, in part, on Gwen Stacy, mainly because the names are the same and they were created around the same time. Now, Sweeter Gwen is a piece of material that Ditko never acknowledged he worked on. Admittedly, saying Ditko denied or never acknowledged the work is a bit misleading. After all, Ditko didn't do interviews and rarely spoke about his work, so his actual opinion is unknown. Any denial regarding his involvement with Sweeter Gwen comes from other anecdotal sources, not Ditko himself. Sweeter Gwen is credited to Eric Stanton, a well-known fetish artist and someone who shared a studio with Ditko between 1958 and 1968. Stanton himself stated, quote, "I asked Steve Ditko to ink Sweeter Gwen for me," unquote. Even without Stanton's confirmation, a casual observer with a passing familiarity with Ditko's style would easily conclude that Ditko was heavily involved with Sweeter Gwen. The point I'm driving at here is that Ditko worked on both projects, Amazing Spider-Man number 31 and Sweeter Gwen. That's confirmed. The question that remains is, was Sweeter Gwen based on Gwen Stacy, who was also, allegedly, based on Joan Lee? Because if that's true, that gives Sweeter Gwen a bit of a distasteful edge. It would be one thing for Ditko to take a completely fictional character and possibly satirize it in a naughty comic. It would be quite another if that character was based on a real person. That would imply an indirect insult to Stan Lee and a problematic depiction of his wife, Joan. So you can understand why I thought this trivial point needed clarification. Stan Lee's involvement with the creation of Gwen Stacy is highly questionable. According to Steve Ditko, at this point in the Spider-Man run, Lee and Ditko didn't speak to one another, not even a little. Quote, "It was generally known at Marvel that Stan Lee chose not to communicate with me on anything before issue 25 of The Amazing Spider-Man. So how could Lee tell me an idea about a storyline he knew nothing about until he saw my pencil pages and my rough panel dialogue for any issue?" I don't have other sources to back that statement up, but it does conform to a few accounts that I've previously read. It was either Saul Brodsky or Roy Thomas who confirmed this information. Probably Thomas. Yes, I'm being lazy. However, I'm pretty comfortable that if someone fact-checks my fact-checking, they'll discover other accounts that confirm Lee and Ditko didn't communicate at all after a certain point. Gwen Stacy first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man number 31, so that's well after the period where Lee and Ditko didn't communicate. Therefore, Lee's involvement with the creation of Gwen Stacy was either completely non-existent or minimal, depending on how much he changed Ditko's dialogue. Unless Ditko randomly decided to create Gwen and base her on Lee's wife, of which there's no evidence that Ditko did that, then it's pretty safe to declare Gwen Stacy was not inspired by Joan Lee. And if Sweeter Gwen was based on Gwen Stacy, as speculation suggests, then there wasn't any malice towards Stan or Joan because there was no connection between Gwen Stacy and Joan. This satisfied my concern whether Ditko made an indirect insult to either Stan or Joan. He didn't. Whether Sweeter Gwen was a naughty parody of Gwen Stacy is another matter entirely. Unfortunately, this conclusion didn't mean my investigation was over. At this point, it has to be acknowledged, the information on Wikipedia may be referring to how Gwen Stacy developed after Ditko left Spider-Man, not her actual creation. Perhaps Stan Lee changed Gwen after Ditko left the comic and he made her personality to be more like his wife. That's still a possibility. After all, Ditko only used the character 4 times before he quit Spider-Man and left Marvel altogether. So technically, Gwen was still in a formative stage and changes could be made. I decided to check the source of that information, as provided on Wikipedia, and I went further down the rabbit hole. The source on Wikipedia is an article concerning the death of Joan Lee in 2017. Rest in peace, Ms. Lee. The specific area being sourced on Wikipedia is this one paragraph. Quote, "Joan, Stan told her, was the inspiration behind Gwen Stacy, the first love of Peter Parker. Stan has always said that I have a cartoon face," she said in an interview in 2002. Unquote. When I originally read that, I realized a few things. It's not in quotes, which would indicate a direct statement from Joan, like the portion concerning her face. So at best, it's a rewording of her intent or an implication Joan made at some point. That's the foundation for the claim that Gwen Stacy was based on Joan. Presumably, the quote originates from the 2002 interview that's mentioned, the video for which is sourced in the article. In fact, it's a video interview available on YouTube. Here's exactly what Joan Lee says in that interview.
Well, the first time that he saw me, he said to somebody, I've drawn that girl's face 1,000 times. I'm going to marry her.
You said he drew your face. Now,
yes.
He described Gwen Stacy. You do? You know Gwen Stacy?
No.
Gwen Stacy is Peter Parker's first love.
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, he told me that, and Stan has always said I have a cartoon face. I never felt that was kind of complimentary, but he felt, little nose, big eyes. That was when I was younger, of course. Big teeth, all of that.
Joan doesn't directly say, at any point during that 7-minute interview, that Gwen Stacy is based on her. In fact, she doesn't even know who the character is. The interviewer has to explain it to her. You'd think, if your partner based a popular character on you and told you about it, you might immediately recall that detail. But hey, memory can be a fuzzy thing at times. And let's be honest, she probably didn't pay any attention to what happened in comic books. It would be a generous interpretation to say the video confirms that Gwen Stacy is based on Joan. By implication, the interviewer may have been heading in that direction, but he never gets there, as he has to explain to Joan who Gwen Stacy is. If one really stretches the context and presumes the interviewer was about to ask if Joan inspired Gwen because Stan claimed to have drawn her face 1,000 times before they met, then one has to further presume that's what Joan also presumed and then responded to. But that's a lot of presumptions. The original article contained a clip with Stan Lee discussing his wife. I also discovered another clip from the same interview where Stan talks about Joan. Neither mentioned Gwen Stacy. So within the article, that is the source on Wikipedia, there is literally nothing to confirm the statement Joan, Stan told her, was the inspiration behind Gwen Stacy, the first love of Peter Parker. It's a quote without attribution. So none of this confirms or resolves the statement cited on Wikipedia. Which leaves the question, where does this information come from? Naturally, I went to Google and searched high and low for some news source that had an actual quote, either from Joan saying Stan said this to her, or Stan directly saying Joan was the inspiration for Gwen Stacy. Montage time. Comic book resources. Gwen was the first serious romantic interest introduced by Stan Lee in Amazing Spider-Man number 31, inspired by his cherished wife, Joan. No attribution, no source. Screen Rant. Created by Stan Lee and artist Steve Ditko, Gwen was modeled on Lee's beloved wife, Joan. No attribution, no source. Looper. Lee claimed multiple times that the design for Gwen was inspired by his wife, Joan. In a 2017 interview, Stan attempted to explain the power of his muse. Here we have a link to the original Telegraph article that is the source on Wikipedia. ABC News. Stan has always said that I have a cartoon face, Joan Lee said in a 2002 interview about being the inspiration for Peter Parker's first love. The article sources the previously mentioned Joan Lee video interview where the interviewer explains who Gwen Stacy is. The Washington Post. Joni was the inspiration for Mary Jane Watson, Peter Parker's first love in the Spider-Man saga. That's not even close to being accurate, and it's the Washington Post. Yikes. I could easily continue and be even more pedantic, but I think the point is clearly made. As a neat side note, every one of those articles, except the one from ABC, were written after 2020. Why is that important? Because the edit to Wikipedia to include the connection between Joan and Gwen was made on September 5th, 2020. So, the odds favor the high possibility the writers of those articles read Wikipedia and went no further. Within this rabbit hole, there is one more key figure, the artist John Romita. Romita was handpicked by Stan Lee to take over Spider-Man after Ditko quit, and he remained on that title for a number of years, up to and including the death of Gwen Stacy. While Ditko set the template for the series, Romita came in and made it his own, which is a testament to the enduring, massive talent of Romita. In numerous interviews, Romita was quite forthcoming and very consistent when discussing his working relationship with Lee, especially how they went about creating stories. Quote, "We would have a verbal plot session together. First it was 2 or 3 hours, then it was an hour. Stan would tell me who he would like to be the villain and personal life threats he would like carried on." Unquote. And when asked whether Lee provided written plots, Romita said, quote, "No, it was all verbal. We would talk together for about an hour. I'd try to make notes and ask him to explain things that I was unclear about. but he never wrote anything down," unquote. Like with Jack Kirby, Lee would give Romita plot beats or characters he wanted to see, and then it was up to Romita to piece it all together. And like Kirby, Romita remembered what he could from their talks, usually forgetting or misremembering details when he illustrated the story. Over time, the plot sessions varied in length, depending on Lee's schedule. Once Lee had confidence in Romita's skills, these sessions were typically a lot shorter. In other words, Romita was integral to shaping characters and the story. Romita also noted, quote, "When I took over the art, Stan said, 'One of the good things about you taking over is that now I can bring Mary Jane into the story.' And I asked Stan what he meant, and he told me that he didn't like the way Ditko was doing Mary Jane," unquote. Which is an interesting statement, considering Ditko drew Mary Jane exactly twice, and both times she was hidden from view. They were amusing brief inserts that illustrated Peter may be missing out on something great while being a superhero. According to Romita's account, Lee was eager to have Mary Jane take an active role in the series. Possibly he wanted to introduce a Betty and Veronica love triangle situation, which Romita resisted. Now going back to the presumption that Lee changed Gwen to be based on his wife once Ditko departed, Romita would have certainly gotten that direction from Lee, but that doesn't seem to have happened. In fact, Romita stated, quote, "When I did Gwen, I did her as icy and cold and aloof as Ditko did," unquote. While Romita did update Gwen's look to the more iconic style everyone knows, she did remain mostly the character that Ditko created. Sure, she partied and wore flattering clothes, but Romita made sure there were character differences between Gwen and the fun-loving Mary Jane. Gwen wasn't a moody grump, but she was a counterpoint to Mary Jane's bubbly, outgoing personality. Aesthetic changes aside, Romita did not indicate there were specific instructions from Stan to alter Gwen to be more like Joan. Romita did, in fact, preserve the template that Ditko created. So, we're still nowhere. Along with a generous interpretation of what Joan said in a 2002 interview, there may be one more contributing factor. The writer and editor, Jerry Conway, made an observation within the book Marvel Comics: The Untold Story, written by Sean Howe in 2012. Notably, Conway is the writer of The Night Gwen Stacy Died, a story that is infamous for killing off Gwen Stacy, if that wasn't obvious from the title. In that book, Conway states, quote, "Only a damaged person would end up with a damaged guy like Peter Parker, and Gwen Stacy was perfect. It was basically Stan fulfilling Stan's own fantasy. Joan Lee was an attractive blonde, who was obviously Stan's ideal female, and I think Gwen was simply Stan replicating his wife, just like Sue Storm was a replication of his wife," unquote. Conway's statement is, let's say, missing a few important details. Joan was a brunette when she met Stan, and in all the pictures I could locate from that era, she remained a brunette for a number of years. When she became a blonde is unclear. Regardless, that's a pretty superficial detail. Furthermore, Romita had a heavy hand in the series, including its direction and character management. I'm going to conveniently overlook the Sue Storm comment so I can stay on point. Oh, excuse me. So there's someone on record stating Gwen was based on Joan, and it's someone familiar with Gwen Stacy. But Conway is expressing what he thinks, rather than stating it was knowledge he acquired from Stan. So it's not exactly confirmation, it's his opinion, nothing more. However, it is something worth mentioning, because if one does a Google search and narrows the results to the years before 2012, the year Conway's statement saw print, there are literally no results for Joan Lee inspiring Gwen Stacy. Between 2012 and 2016, the year before Joan passed, the only results that mention a connection between Gwen and Joan are news items quoting Jerry Conway from the Sean Howe book. After 2017, the year Joan Lee passed away, this connection becomes prevalent and mentioned in practically every article posted about Joan. Additionally, the connection appears in a number of articles detailing Gwen Stacy's past or origin. Were these 2 points, Joan's interview and Conway's opinion, conflated to become an often repeated fact? I don't know, but the evidence is somewhat compelling. The statement that Joan Lee is the inspiration for Gwen Stacy comfortably sits within the realm of highly questionable information. It's something no one seems to have investigated and confirmed. Without an actual source, it's just something someone wrote, and everyone ran with it because it sounds true. The problem is, there doesn't seem to be anything in the public record that confirms this. Or if there is, it's buried so deep that a reasonably thorough search will produce no results. Believe me, I did a lot more searching and reading than that little montage earlier. Obviously, I didn't read or watch every Stan Lee interview in existence. So somewhere out there, in some distant, obscure article or video, Stan or Joan may very well have said this. Or I missed something in my volumes of reading or watching. Which is why I say it's highly questionable, not an outright obvious fabrication. With all that's been evaluated, let's try to answer the question. Was Joan Lee the inspiration for Gwen Stacy, Peter Parker's first love? If you're talking about her creation, then no. Not unless Steve Ditko had a thing for Stan's wife, and it was a whole Patty Boyd, George Harrison, and Eric Clapton type of scenario. But there's no evidence to suggest Ditko even met Joan, let alone developed a profound crush on her. What about after Ditko left? Well, Gwen did loosen up a bit, and her style changed. But the artist, John Romita, didn't specify any directions from Lee to alter Gwen. In fact, Romita continued to portray Gwen as the character Ditko had created. So again, the answer is no. There's no evidence that Gwen was changed to be like Joan. This may not be the answer you like, but it's the one you have. Notably, the Wikipedia page that inspired this investigation was edited, and the information concerning Joe Lee being the inspiration for Gwen Stacy was removed. Although Joan Lee's page retains that information. Personally, I always suspected Ditko based Gwen on either Ayn Rand or Dagny, the female lead in Atlas Shrugged. But honestly, I've never done the research to see if that might be true. I mean, I read the novel once, and that was more than enough for me in this lifetime. So that's going to be an area of examination that I'm too lazy to explore. Now, let's look at a big topic. What did Ditko intend to do with the Green Goblin? And did a dispute over his identity lead to Ditko leaving Spider-Man? One of the most enduring questions about Steve Ditko is the reason why he quit Amazing Spider-Man. Many believe a disagreement over the identity of the Green Goblin was the reason he left. As evidence to support this theory, in the issue following Ditko's departure, Norman Osborn is revealed to be the masked villain, a development that Ditko allegedly resisted. The timing of the two events, Ditko leaving and the Green Goblin being unmasked, seemed less than coincidental. It's very easy to conclude one led to the other. Furthermore, Stan Lee has, on numerous occasions, stated that he and Ditko had a falling out over the character's identity. Lee stopped short of saying that's the reason for Ditko's departure, but the heavy, unmistakable implication is that shortly after this argument, Ditko quit. Finally, Ditko remained radio silent. His perspective on events was utterly unknown. So Lee's account became the official narrative, and over the decades, others filled in the gaps with speculation concerning Ditko's reasons. As this video will demonstrate, Ditko didn't leave Marvel as a result of a disagreement with Lee over the Green Goblin's identity. Furthermore, the issue of Green Goblin's identity was never intended to be someone random. These claims will be supported by some circumstantial evidence, and the one thing usually overlooked, Ditko's own words. First, we have to look at the working relationship between Lee and Ditko. For roughly the first 16 issues, they would have in-person plotting sessions. They'd discuss the villain, the story of the issue, and various other details. From there, Ditko would go to his studio, draw the entire issue, and type out notes for Lee to follow when he wrote the dialogue. Ditko would take these pages into Lee, where they would discuss any artwork changes, and design a cover. Ditko would note the changes in the margins of each page. The issue was then scripted by Lee and sent off to be lettered, while Ditko drew the cover. When the lettered pages were ready, Ditko would pick them up, make any necessary artwork changes, and ink them. He'd turn those pages in, and the whole process started again. During this time, Lee and Ditko would disagree over certain elements. One such disagreement was over the new character, the Green Goblin. According to Ditko, quote, Stan's synopsis for the Green Goblin had a movie crew, on location, finding an Egyptian-like sarcophagus. Inside was an ancient mythological demon, the Green Goblin. He naturally comes to life. I rejected Stan's idea." Unquote. The Green Goblin debuted in issue 14 with no suggestion of an origin. There was a movie production though, so Lee's idea wasn't entirely discarded. Presuming Ditko's account is accurate, this might be where the rift begins. Because if true, Lee couldn't have been too pleased that Ditko rejected his plot and did his own thing. Regardless, this conflict between the two would continue to grow. A few months later, in issue 17, Lee announced, quote, "And as for old Spidey, next issue is gonna be real different. The whole plot was dreamed up by Sonny Steve, and it was just nutty enough for Stan to okay it. You'll see Spidey acting differently than ever before. Nuff said." Unquote. What was so different about that issue, one might ask? In the prior issue, Aunt May wound up in the hospital while Peter was fighting the Green Goblin. Feeling guilty, Peter decides to give up being Spider-Man and care for his aunt. In the next issue, entirely done by Ditko, Spider-Man avoids any conflict, even running away from Sandman at one point. In the end, Aunt May turns out to be fine, and J. Jonah Jameson's editorials, calling Spider-Man a phony, inspire Peter to become Spider-Man again. So yes, a unique classic take on the struggles Peter Parker faces as Spider-Man. It was certainly different than the standard Marvel action story. As noted by John Morrow in the wonderful compilation, Stuff Said, Lee developed a habit of using the letter page, his monthly soapbox, and the next issue solicitations to gently take shots at his collaborators. The line, "You'll see Spidey acting differently than ever before," lacks any context and could be seen as a light, playful jab, or promotional hyperbole. Within context, knowing he and Ditko argued over the plot, it could be interpreted as Lee venting his frustration and gently suggesting to the readers that if the next issue sucks, it's because of Ditko. Admittedly, that may be reading too much into a simple statement. However, there was at least one occasion where Lee was rather petty. He stated, quote, "I don't plot Spider-Man anymore. Steve Ditko, the artist, has been doing the series. I guess I'll leave him alone until sales start to slip. Since Spidey got so popular, Ditko thinks he's the genius of the world. We were arguing so much over plot lines, I told him to start making up his own stories. He won't let anybody else ink his drawings either. He just drops off the finished pages with notes at the margins, and I fill in the dialogue." Unquote. That is a rather antagonistic portrayal of Ditko, and it clearly supports the fact that Lee kept his distance from him, and his involvement with Spider-Man was limited to writing the dialogue. In Ditko's defense, some details, such as the webbing on Spider-Man's outfit, wouldn't be added until the inking stage. Furthermore, he sometimes needed to make artwork changes. Since he was a capable inker, it only made sense that he'd make those changes, and then ink the pages to avoid delaying an issue. However, Lee implies Ditko is a finicky control freak who wouldn't allow his work to be inked by anyone else. It conveniently overlooks the practical, expedient side of Ditko doing the work. The defense rests, Your Honor. Now, the point isn't to disparage Lee's character, but to note the creators were not getting along during the second year of Spider-Man's run, and by the third year, they weren't speaking to one another. Naturally, their working relationship also changed. Somewhere around issue 20, Lee and Ditko stopped having story discussions. Instead, Ditko drew the entire issue, plotting it entirely on his own, and making typed notes. He'd hand those pages to Lee, who would script the dialogue. At some point, the production manager, Saul Brodsky, would intervene on Lee's behalf and take Ditko's penciled pages. Ditko would receive them back from Brodsky after they were lettered and needed to be inked. From accounts by Lee, Ditko, and other observers, such as Brodsky and the assistant editor, Roy Thomas, by issue 25, possibly earlier, the two never spoke or interacted at all. Lee stated the silence was Ditko's choice. Ditko denied this. The reason they didn't speak was because the employer, Stan Lee, decided they wouldn't speak. As an employee, Ditko couldn't choose to not talk to his boss. He didn't have that power. In my opinion, that is the only scenario that makes sense. Anyone who's ever held a job knows if your boss wants to chat, you have no choice but to have a chat. You can't avoid it, or you might be looking for another job. Conversely, if you want to chat and the boss is unavailable, you don't have that chat. It's that simple. So it seems highly unlikely that Ditko put up that wall of silence. That said, once Brodsky started taking his work, it became obvious to Ditko this lack of communication was the new normal. So, while he didn't create that wall of silence, he probably didn't do anything to repair it either. This brings us back to the Green Goblin once again. During Ditko's time, he was a recurring villain that was featured in 5 issues. The Green Goblin was, in essence, a malicious, Joker-like character that always evaded capture and seemed to revel in taunting Spider-Man. Because he always escaped, the Green Goblin's identity was unknown. This created an ongoing mystery that kept the readers guessing. According to legend, Lee and Ditko clashed over the Green Goblin's identity, leading to Ditko quitting. However, at the time Ditko quit, he and Lee hadn't spoken for at least a year. Therefore, Ditko didn't quit because Lee put his foot down and demanded the Goblin be a known character. Furthermore, Lee and Ditko likely never had an argument over the Green Goblin's identity. When the Goblin first appeared, in issue 14, Lee wanted him to be a supernatural being. He was merely a goblin from ancient Egyptian times that had no secret identity. Ditko ignored that origin story, grounded the character as human, and gave him a secret civilian identity. The Goblin next appeared in issue 17, and it's here where a disagreement could have occurred. With the character returning, Lee and Ditko could have had a discussion concerning his identity and when to reveal it. This is utter speculation on my part, and there's nothing on the record to suggest such a conversation took place. However, this is an attempt to reconcile Lee's memory of an argument within the timeline of events. If it happened at all, and that is highly suspect, it had to have happened at this point. Because, with the first appearance, Lee hadn't even considered a secret identity, so an argument then makes no sense. By the time the Goblin appears again, in issue 23, the two were barely speaking, if at all. So, if an argument actually occurred, it had to have happened in this time period, not more than a year later, as Lee implies. Continuing with this point, the editor, Roy Thomas, provides a plausible explanation for Lee's memory of an argument. In issue 27, which features the Green Goblin, it's revealed the criminal, the crime master, is a complete nobody. Not to mention, he expires just before revealing the Green Goblin's true identity. Thomas suggests that Lee conflates these two plot beats. If an argument did occur, it was over the crime master being no one of consequence. But again, by Ditko's account, by this time the two weren't speaking. So Lee's memory of an argument doesn't fit the series of events, and the justifications for it are pure speculation. Conveniently, the crime master being a nobody undercuts Lee's assertion that Ditko wanted the Goblin to be an unknown character. Once a nobody plot beat was used, it would be highly unlikely Ditko would repeat it, especially for a high-profile character such as the Green Goblin. It would be some terrible storytelling. Concerning this subject, Ditko wrote, quote, "I knew from day one, from the first Green Goblin story, who the GG would be. I absolutely knew because I planted him in J. Jonah Jameson's Businessman's Club. It was where JJJ and the GG would be seen together. I planted them together in other stories where the GG would not appear in costume. I wanted JJJ's and the GG's lives to mix for later story drama involving more than just the two characters. I planted the GG's son, same distinctive hairstyle, in the college issues for more dramatic involvement and storyline consequences." Unquote. Regardless of any conclusions one might come to concerning Ditko's memory of events, what he has to say should not be discounted. His version is, at the very least, as valid as Stan Lee's. It may contradict some areas of long-repeated Marvel history, but that's what makes it a worthwhile area of examination, in my opinion. Objectively, it's difficult to accept that Ditko knew who the Green Goblin was right from the first appearance. There's simply no evidence to support that claim. However, there's plenty of circumstantial evidence to suggest he knew the Green Goblin's secret identity long before it was revealed, and he was building towards exposing the villain. The Green Goblin's third appearance, in issue 23, contains a background cameo of Norman Osborn, who was seen at J. Jonah Jameson's club. He is, however, unnamed and has no dialogue. This is his first appearance. Issues 26 and 27 are the Goblin's next appearance. Both issues also contain Norman Osborn cameos. Osborn has a speaking part in both, but at the time, he still has no name. Regardless, it's clear he's a recurring character who Jameson talks with on a regular basis. Harry Osborn is introduced in issue 31. He looks very similar to the unnamed, older character from the club. Harry would be one of the supporting cast who antagonizes Peter Parker at college. In issue 37, it's revealed that Jameson's friend is Norman Osborn, the father of Harry. It's also pretty clear that Norman is a pretty shady character who doesn't want Spider-Man around. In fact, he knocks Spider-Man out, hoping a wild robot will finish him off. As if to hammer this home, on the final page, Norman holds a rifle, thinking Spider-Man needs to be taken out. The next issue, Norman puts on a disguise and tries to hire someone to get rid of Spider-Man. Notably, Norman wears a lot of green, one of the Goblin's main colors. It's also worth noting, the Green Goblin has not shown up for almost a year, so it's time for the villain to reappear. Unfortunately, this is Ditko's final issue, and this direction remains unfinished. Now, Ditko is known to chart plots and subplots well in advance. This is confirmed by the Charlton editor, Dick Giordano, who visited Ditko's studio in 1965. Quote, "The dispute was, he thought he was writing Spider-Man, but Stan Lee was getting the credit. As proof, he showed me a chart he had up on the wall that said when certain things were going to happen for the next 6 issues. Plots, subplots, and how they were going to interact over that 6-issue span." Unquote. While Norman Osborn's first appearance may have been somewhat random, it seems that Ditko had a specific direction in mind by the time Harry is introduced. Their similar, distinct appearance could not have been coincidental. So Ditko is making subtle connections that won't pay off for a while. After which, Norman takes on a villain role. He's clearly broadcasting that he hates Spider-Man, and it's obvious Ditko is building towards something. All of this supports Ditko's statement that he knew the Green Goblin was Norman Osborn, because Norman was being set up for a major role. To add extra drama, his son, Harry, was involved with Spider-Man's secret identity, Peter Parker. Of course, Norman being the friend of J. Jonah Jameson would also add some dramatic depth. All of this is quite deliberate and planned out in advance. This context and all of this build-up suggests that Ditko was going to reveal that Norman Osborn was the Green Goblin. While not evidence, it's worth noting John Romita's opinion on this subject. Romita took over Spider-Man immediately after Ditko quit, and he did the artwork for the Goblin's identity reveal. Romita said, quote, "I didn't know there was any doubt about Osborn being the Goblin. I didn't know that Ditko had just been setting Osborn up as a straw dog. I just accepted the fact that it was going to be Norman Osborn when we plotted it. I had been following the last couple of issues and didn't think there was really much mystery about it." Unquote. Just to be complete, in a conversation with Bob Sheridan in 1966, Romita allegedly said, "The choice of Norman Osborn as the Green Goblin was Ditko's. Lee was going to have the Green Goblin revealed to be Ned Leeds, but Ditko was too fond of Ned, so he drew the mags so that Osborn had to be the Goblin." However, the passage in question is not a direct quote. That's known as hearsay, Your Honor. I'm only including it here to avoid comments pointing out Romita said Lee wanted the Goblin to be Ned Leeds. It's not Romita's exact words, and the source of Romita's information is unknown, making it double hearsay. As evidence, it is highly suspect. Regardless, Ditko's words on the subject, and the published material that supports it, is strong circumstantial evidence that he knew the Green Goblin was Norman Osborn. So why did Ditko quit? The answer may be rather simple. He quit on principle. Certainly, there were a few more factors, but it boils down to Ditko's principles. I know, in this TikTok influencer world, principles are a foreign concept, so I'll have to elaborate. As is well known, Ditko started to adhere to the philosophy of objectivism, which is different than objectivity. Objectivity is a lack of bias. It's not pushing a narrative in one direction or another. Objectivism is based on Aristotle's law of identity, with a little pro-capitalism sprinkled on top. To paraphrase Ditko, the foundation of objectivism is based on A is A. A thing is what it is. It either is or it isn't that thing. There are no contradictions or gray areas, especially with morality. Something is either good or not good. This is an oversimplification of a philosophical approach that is, in my opinion, an effort in oversimplification itself. How does this apply to Spider-Man? Ditko was doing all the work on Spider-Man, receiving a plotting and artwork credit. Lee was getting credit for the writing. However, in Ditko's view, he was the actual writer. Lee was simply writing dialogue from his notes, so the credits were wrong. Lee was getting recognition for something he didn't do, and Ditko's own role seemed to be greatly diminished. Believe me, in subsequent years, Ditko has written a lot about people assuming unearned credit, so this was clearly a point that bothered him greatly. Now apply Ditko's objectivism principles to this scenario. He had identified that the credits were incorrect, and presumably, he attempted to get them corrected. However, despite his objections, Lee continued to take credit as the writer. Within objectivism, once something immoral, such as unearned credit, has been identified, taking no action and allowing it to continue is just as immoral as doing the act itself. So if Ditko allowed this inaccurate credit to continue while creating Spider-Man comics, he would be endorsing Lee's immoral act. And in turn, that would make him as bad as Lee. On principle, Ditko couldn't allow that. As some have pointed out, Ditko and Jack Kirby had been promised profit sharing from the publisher, Martin Goodman, specifically for merchandise related to the characters they created. Naturally, Goodman was under no legal obligation to share profits, so he didn't. But allegedly, he dangled the possibility to give both Kirby and Ditko incentive to remain at Marvel. While Ditko wasn't completely motivated by money, after all, he walked away from a good paycheck from Marvel, this can't be discounted outright. It somewhat ties into his principles of getting paid for the work he was producing. In comparison, Ditko was also doing work for Charlton, having revived Blue Beetle and Captain Atom. It was there he got proper credit. Furthermore, it wasn't a hostile work environment. One can't overlook the fact that Ditko was a human being, and it could not have been pleasant to, air quotes, collaborate with Lee, who avoided his presence. Not to mention, Lee was waiting for sales to slip on Spider-Man so he could justify taking control of the title and fire Ditko. So that negative undercurrent probably had an effect on Ditko. That said, this is mainly speculative. In fact, Ditko's actual reason for leaving Marvel is nothing but speculation. On the topic, Ditko merely stated, quote, "There have been many claim knowers of why I quit Spider-Man and Marvel. Stan and I were arguing over, disputing who is, or should be, the Green Goblin, over not getting promised royalties and other known, floating, arbitrary truths, the real stories, reasons, fantasies, by comic book fans and fan publications, historians. All such claimers lack first-hand knowledge. All are guessing, creating their own reasons, fictions, and fantasies. The only person who had the right to know why I was quitting refused to come out of his office or to call me in." Unquote. Ditko spitefully acknowledges and implies all the theories are incorrect, but he doesn't say that outright, leaving the topic open for interpretation. So the actual reason remains unknown. During the edit of the video, I realized there was a few items I overlooked when compiling the research into a script. I don't think their exclusion necessarily changes the content of the video, still they're worth noting, so I'll add them here. Allegedly, after quitting in 1965, Ditko wrote down his memory of events, presumably to preserve it for later use, or maybe it was closure, I don't know. Anyway, that writing, if it exists, doesn't seem to be in the public record, so I couldn't verify its validity. Hopefully, if it's discovered among his records and then made available, that would be a very valuable, informative document. Another piece of trivia was the suggestion that Ditko brought in his pages on the days Lee wasn't in the office. This implies Ditko avoided Lee. While that's possible, it might have happened incidentally rather than on purpose. And, in my opinion, if Ditko did this intentionally, it didn't start until after Brodsky started taking Ditko's work. But in my judgment, that still seems out of character for Ditko. The one lingering question I couldn't resolve is, what inspired Ditko to finally break his silence and write extensive essays about Spider-Man and his experience at Marvel? Unfortunately, the precise reason will never be known. This is not a question that Ditko addressed directly. I suspect there are a number of factors, ones that accumulated over the years, and it got to the point where Ditko decided to finally set the record straight and share his point of view. However, that's speculation on my part. Now let's look at a Ditko essay that reveals his dislike concerning Stan Lee taking credit for plots and characters he created. One of the largest losses to anyone with an interest in comic book history was the passing of Steve Ditko in 2018. With him went significant insight into the early days of the comic book industry and his own unique perspective concerning pivotal moments. However, Ditko did write a fair amount of essays where he addressed some aspects of his creative process. But these works are not very well documented and very difficult to obtain. Which brings me to the focus of this video. Recently, I was able to acquire The Avenging Mind by Steve Ditko. It was an issue printed in 2008 that primarily contained nothing but written essays. Those essays mainly focused on Stan Lee. In it, Ditko recounts his perspective concerning significant events in Marvel Comics history, such as the creation of Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. It also reveals aspects of the creative process at Marvel during his time there, and, very specifically, his working relationship with Stan Lee. And, well, these essays are quite revealing. Presumably, Ditko decided to write these out as a response to various statements made by Lee throughout the years, and perhaps as a refuting of the credit that was shared with Lee in the Spider-Man movies. It may be that Ditko was morally outraged that Lee was getting widespread recognition for a character that he shaped and designed. After all, Ditko, as a student of the objectivism philosophical movement, would see this crediting of Lee as a moral wrong. Philosophically and morally, Lee was getting unearned credit. As a student of objectivism, it would be Ditko's responsibility to correct this inaccuracy. Otherwise, if he chose no action, he would be permitting wrongness to continue and proliferate, which makes him as wrong and morally culpable as Stan Lee. Again, that's speculation on my part. I cannot state that's the proper context for why Ditko decided, after 40 years of silence, to add his corrections to Marvel Comics history. It's what makes sense to me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that was the actual motivation on Ditko's part. With that said, I'm going to read one essay titled Creative Crediting. In it, Ditko, like Jack Kirby before him, greatly diminishes Lee's role in the creation of a story. Overall, it's an examination of who deserves credit and how that credit should be applied. While this isn't the most blistering essay Ditko wrote about Lee, it's certainly unflattering. For the sake of transparency, this is a slightly edited version of Ditko's essay. Every effort was made not to change the content or context of Ditko's words, but slight edits had to be done for the sake of clarity, and it's simply a practical necessity when one adapts a written essay into a spoken word piece. Now, on with the actual essay. Let's examine Lee's creative crediting method to see who benefits and who loses, how and why it's done, and if it's fair. Lee's crediting method was not in numbers, but in language, using words to conceal, manipulate, distort, or falsify the factual truth. His basic method was subjective and not objective. There's a long list of examples of Lee's creative crediting style. Script, Stan Lee. Art, Steve Ditko. Written by Stan Lee and illustrated by Steve Ditko. Scripted by Stan Lee and plotted and drawn by Steve Ditko. None are consistent in fact and actual meaning, and so all are non-objective and untrue. By using such terms and phrases as scripted by, script and editing by, and written by, in crediting himself, Lee implied or claimed that he had written not a synopsis, but he had actually and factually written a full script. All of these combinations of Stan's credits are all claiming or implying a full script by Lee. In using such terms and phrases as illustrated by, artwork by, and illustrations in crediting me, all of which are factually, truthfully incorrect identifications, Lee is claiming my artwork was done from his full script. Yet, Lee never wrote a full script for me. Lee's creative crediting style implied or claimed that I was only following what he fully scripted for every panel, and that I was only just illustrating all his panel ideas, his fully scripted pages/panel ideas, that he had laid out all the necessary detail. It is essential to understand what a full script is and means. A full script contains all the needed panels for every page, and all the needed panel descriptions for the type of panel, setting, drama, action, mood, etc. The script has all the panel descriptions, all the dialogue, and sound effects. The script is a complete comic book word story and is only lacking in everything visual. The illustrator's job is to put the script's specific people, places, action, etc. in a composition, in a story panel picture. Lee's creative credit, labeling me as an illustrator, was claiming that I worked from his fully written script. He therefore denied me having any role in the actual comic book storyline. Any role in deciding how many panels for every page, and the exact story content for every panel. I have no need to supply, decide, or solve any story drama or action problem. So I, as an illustrator, was merely following and could only follow from a full script. Lee's creative crediting meant that Lee wrote full scripts and never needed an artist, only an illustrator. His use of the labels illustrator, art, artwork, etc. were arbitrary. A more honest crediting could have been a co-creation by writer Stan Lee and artist Steve Ditko. Lee's crediting style upgraded a 1 to 1.5 page synopsis to the creative credit status of a full script, needing only an illustrator to do the artwork. Lee thereby downgraded the need for a certain kind of artist. An authentic full script is where the scriptwriter has solved all the page/panel problems. His every page contains panels laid out, and every panel has its needed captions, dialogue material, sound effects, and a scene description of who is involved in an action, drama, or setting, and what is going on and how. The scriptwriter provides all the needed captions and sound effects. He is even giving or suggesting angles, such as close-ups, long shots, or down shots, and even relevant props, mood, etc. Compare a scriptwriter's 20-page script with a synopsis writer's 1 to 1.5 page synopsis. Is anything important missing? An illustrator of a full script illustrates, makes visual what is given in words/writing. The full script writer provides the what and the why. The illustrator provides the how the best he can. The illustrator is relatively passive as to the storyline content of what is going on in the panels. The illustrator's main virtue is his particular art style, of how he designs a panel, does faces, and figure work, whether his pen or brush technique has a stylistic or realistic visual effect. With a synopsis, the incomplete storyline material, there is an actual need for more than an illustrator and even more than an artist. A synopsis must have an artist plus. An artist plus has to take what is incomplete, what is partly provided, and add new story ideas, to fill in, expand, provide everything else needed to make a complete whole word/picture story. The artist plus has to finish a synopsis writer's work and supply and do much of what a full script writer does to take the 1 to 1.5 page synopsis and expand it into a full-page comic book story of 20 pages. The Artist Plus has to supply rough dialogue for every panel for the writer or dialoguer to polish, to provide better storytelling, continuity, etc. So every illustrator credit for a needed Artist Plus is worse than wrong. It is deliberately denying and rejecting the need, the worth, and the value of the one person who is actually making the abstract written ideas into a picture story. The Artist Plus makes the comic book writer's story idea publishable, makes them able to be bought, seen, read, and enjoyed, and to go into syndication/reprints with all their future benefits or prestige. There has never been a full Spider-Man script by Lee, so no one is entitled to any kind of full script or creator credit, or even any kind of implied full credit. That kind of full credit can only be achieved with creative crediting. And the creative crediting stunt was not done by the front office. Regrettably, the creative crediting was done by the one who was a working story/art partner. A more honest, a more just crediting, showing the actual division of labor used in publishing comics, was needed from the very start. That shortcoming, that error, shows or demonstrates that what is not made explicit is not in conscious control. So whoever has any advantage can try to make the most of it at another's expense. The above should be more than enough to show Lee's creative crediting, claiming, and credit keeping. And it should alert, even convince, others not to accept an authority or a prestige or a claim, but to seek some real, credible proof. If what has been done or is being done wrong is not explored, not exposed, not openly and publicly examined, never to be acknowledged or corrected, then no proper principle of right and wrong behavior can be known or be possible. Then everyone can become an ignored victim of the seekers of the unearned, the undeserved, of injustice. That last paragraph really gives off a Mr. A vibe, doesn't it? In other essays, Ditko elaborates a bit more on the points he brings up in this one. Namely, that Lee has only earned credit for putting into action a vague idea that was shaped and created by someone else. Lee's involvement was merely as a facilitator to the actual creator. The creation of Spider-Man being an example, the writing of Spider-Man being another example. To clarify that a bit, and to provide a little more context, for an issue of Spider-Man, Lee and Ditko would discuss a plot, where Lee would give Ditko a 1 or 1.5 page synopsis to work from. Ditko would then, entirely on his own, break down the story and draw it. Additionally, he provided, on separate pages, dialogue and captions for Lee to reference so he knew what was happening in that story. Then Lee would polish the script for publication before sending it off to be lettered. Furthermore, according to Ditko, around issue 15 of Spider-Man, Lee had little or no involvement with plotting the story, and shortly thereafter, they didn't speak at all. So the writing credit Lee gave to himself was rather generous and factually erroneous, in Ditko's opinion. All of this naturally leads to one important question. Is Ditko a reliable narrator? Despite his approach being one of facts and objectivity, it's difficult not to hear the tempered frustration and disgust in Ditko's words. So there's a level of emotionality in what he's written. Words matter, as the saying goes, and Ditko's word choices and phrasing read very accusatory. However, he does make a compelling, if not somewhat drawn-out, argument. Regardless of any conclusions one might come to concerning Ditko's memory of events, or whether his passion or frustration influenced this material, what he has to say should not be discounted. Ditko's version may contradict some areas of long-repeated, rose-colored Marvel history, and that is a worthwhile area of examination, in my opinion. Perhaps the only area of critique that's worth mentioning is Ditko's endpoint. That Stan Lee's numerous claims shouldn't be accepted at face value and then accepted as true. In that, Ditko is correct. However, the only person with an insider perspective on said claims, Ditko himself, was reluctant to speak on the record in any capacity. So the only actual person who could have supplied a different perspective, who could have corrected Lee's numerous public statements, was entirely silent. Logically, without Ditko's input, it would have been very difficult to challenge Lee's statements without some contradictory evidence as a foundation. Doing otherwise just makes one look like a jerk who uses their baseless opinion to create clickbait content. That brings us to the ending of this compilation examining Ditko's time on Spider-Man. It's a point of history that has a lot of interest, but very little information, which is what makes it a compelling subject with a fair amount of speculation. Hopefully, in the years to come, the Ditko estate goes through the material left behind and finds more material for fans to examine. Thank you for watching. Thanks to all my fine supporters on Patreon and YouTube. Your ongoing support makes it possible for this channel to continue. I appreciate every single one of you. Please subscribe if you've not already. Leave a comment and a like. I try to keep ads and self-promotional bits like this to a minimum. So if you can, consider directly supporting this channel on Patreon. Extra special thanks to Spencer Estes, Green Man, Constant Disappointment Records, Jeff Nicholson, Sickin, Francis De La Cruz, Russell Bull, John Nyukes, Andrew Barton, Odin Ashcroft, Ruby St. Dennis, Phil Sagan, Edward Clayton Andrew, Corey Drew, Brian Deaton, Tom Granis, John Gaunt, James Graham, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient. Bebop, boop, boop, bebop.